this question that developed in the panel on Chatham House rules, whereby you're not permitted to quote any speaker by name. I should mention that FPRI's position is we operate by random house rules, which means we take offense if you don't quote us by name. For those of you who are not familiar with FPRI, we actually started as part of the University of Pennsylvania back in 1955, though we're now an independent, freestanding nonprofit. We were founded by Robert Strauss Upenn, who was key in fashioning international relations into a formal academic discipline back then. And then he went on to found the Foreign Policy Research Institute on the premise that a nation should think before it acts, which was good advice then and remains good advice today. Our mission being to bring the insights of scholarship to bear on the foreign policy challenges facing the United States. And we do this through another Strauss-Upennian method, which was the geopolitical analysis, which is to examine contemporary international affairs through the lens of history, geography, and culture. Or as my colleague Jim Kurth likes to say, we study the realities of the mentalities of the localities. With the annexation of Crimea, that has thrust Eurasia into prominence and as an arena of global competition, reminiscent of those issues that inspired Strauss-Upenn to found FPRI 60 years ago. And it also inspired us to establish a new Eurasia program directed by Ambassador Adrian Masora and John Haynes, who you'll hear from later this afternoon. So we're pleased to partner with the University of Pennsylvania on this occasion. It's an important topic of discussion and debate. And I'll now turn to Philip Nichols to introduce our keynote speaker.
It truly is an honor to be asked to introduce the next speaker. Timothy Snyder is an extraordinary scholar. He is the Bird White Howson Professor of History at Yale. He is fluent in 5 languages, reads 10. He's deeply involved in Europe, the United States, the world. But most importantly, this talk is titled Unmasterable History. If there is anyone who can master this history, it is the author of 5 puzzling books, not the least of which is Floodland's Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. It is a person who, in all of his writing, exhibits extraordinary subtle understanding of the complexities of history, the present, and is probably going to tell us about the future. It is really an honor and a privilege to have Timothy Snyder here with us today.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to be invited by Mitchell Ornstein. What Mitchell said is absolutely correct. Please eat while I talk. Please do. I'll try to make this clear enough that you can multitask and that you can eat and listen. Please don't do any third thing. Please, especially you young people, just eat and talk. All right, listen. We have just a little bit of time together. We have about 45 minutes for this exchange. So all I want to do is share with you one idea. And it goes very directly to the notion of geopolitics and very directly to the notion of understanding the realities of the mentalities of the localities. What I'd like to do in this little exposition is make a claim about fascist geopolitics, make a claim that there is a fascist framework for geopolitics and that it is relevant, not in the sense that I'd like to introduce it into American political science discourse alongside the other variants of international relations theory, but in the sense that if one is serious about understanding world views one has to take them as internally consistent and serious, and that from within inside them, one can then generate productive understandings and even predictions. Now, why is it justified to talk about a fascist geopolitics when speaking about Russia? The first reason has to do with the conundra, I think that's the plural conundrum, somebody correct me, the conundra of considering the problems we see in Russia, Ukraine, Europe from more conventional points of view. It's very hard, I think, to explain, although very, very smart people have tried, it's very hard to explain Russia's actions from the point of view of realism. Why would you, when you're in a natural position to balance between Europe and China, try to get rid of the European side of the balance and condemn yourself to being a kind of Chinese client forever? Why, when you have the longest land border in the world, would you discredit the international norm of territorial integrity and sovereignty? Why, when your economy is largely dependent upon Europe, would you condemn yourself to the impoverishment of your population, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? One can go on. What I'm trying to say is it's very hard by way of realism, institutionalism, economic interests to explain in a straightforward way what Russia has done. There's another interesting challenge to the way we think about foreign relations, and that has to do with the nature of the actors involved. This is a little trickier. None of the actors involved, I think, are fully fledged states in the normal sense. I think so. If you think about the crisis that's unfolded in the last 5 years between Russia, Ukraine, and the European Union, all of these entities have some aspect of incomplete statehood, or some way in which they're striving to be a state, or some way that they're striving to prevent someone else from being a state. It's as though statehood is the question, right, rather than the axiom. To my way of seeing things, and I'll develop this a bit later on, the crisis we are faced with begins in 2011 with the ostentatious falsification of Russian democratic elections, which removes from Russian political life a basic feature of state sovereignty, which is a principle of succession. Right? In order to be a state, you have to have a principle of succession, and Russia now has no principle of succession. This is the deep, dark, unbelievably open secret of Russian politics, and I think it's essential to everything which happens after that. The Ukrainian movement in 2013, 2014 was based upon the proposition that the Ukrainian state alone was not sufficient to be sovereign. It was an invitation to the European Union to come in and help with the rule of law. That's what Ukrainians were on the street about, right? So in a different way, that's an acknowledgement of the incompletion of sovereignty. And of course, the European Union itself is not, we all know this, is not a state at all in any conventional sense. So none of the actors are conventional states. Now, that's one way of introducing the subject of fascism, because fascism is a framework which is very comfortable with the state not being at the center of analysis. It's very comfortable with interests not being tangible, right? The interests being irrational, invisible, personal, ineffable. It's also very comfortable with the notion of disorder as opposed to order. It's very comfortable with the goal of disorder as a goal of foreign policy. Okay, that's all very theoretical. Why do I have any right to apply this to Russia? Well, when we talk about fascism, and we're all doing it these days, let's face it, I mean, everybody pretty much, no matter what your job description or way of life is you're tempted to talk about fascism. It's very hard. I mean, you don't have to agree with me. I know it's true. It's very hard not to look around the world and think about fascism, right? Generally, fascism appears in two guises. One is that we use it as a term of opprobrium, right? A fascist is somebody else who we don't like, right? That's the kind of standard Russian usage, but it also works in Latin America and in points across the United States as well. And then the second way the term fascism appears is by way of an analogy, right? So people ask, is, for example, Trump like someone in the 1920s or 1930s, right? Or is Putin like someone in the 1920s and 1930s? We ask if the present moment is like the 1920s and 1930s. Which it is, but what I want to do is suggest something else. That it could be that there's another way that the history of fascism is relevant. It could be that there are fascist thinkers, or for this purpose of this talk, a particular fascist thinker who was active in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, into the 50s, and whose legacy has been very actively picked up in the 1990s, 2000s, and into the present, right? In other words, it could be that fascism as an intellectual current is still developing, and that development might deserve our attention. So as every Russia specialist in the room probably already knows, the figure that I have in mind is Ivan Ilyin, right? Who has been very much picked up in fairly ostentatious ways in the Russian elite in the last decade. It is rare, for example, that a president reburies a philosopher. Right? Try to think of another example of a president reburying a philosopher. Putin had Ilyin reburied in 2005. He lays flowers at the grave. The reburying people was also, by the way, very fascist, just to like get our minds rolling. He puts flowers at the grave, which is not necessarily fascist, that's fine. Maybe not that grave in particular, but you know, in general it's okay. The archives removed from Michigan State, 2006. The entire corpus, except for the really nasty stuff, has basically been republished in Russia in the last 20 years. And then at the key moments, Russian and domestic foreign policy, during the ostentatious falsification of the elections of December 2011, and then during the annexation of Crimea in 2014, Putin cites Ilyin as a defense for what he's doing. I think that's also worth noting. So what I'm trying to suggest is that there's a basic problem in Russian politics, which has to do with the nature of the system. This was in a way I'm pulling now from the end of the last session. There's a basic problem in Russian politics, which is the lack of a succession principle. That's a question. And the answer to that question, I'm going to try to argue, is accepting basically a fascist framework of geopolitics. Okay, so now that I've gone this far, and no one's throwing me out of the room yet, who was Ivan Ilyin? Right? What did he represent? What was his thinking like? He was a major and very impressive, very prolific Russian philosopher. He was a standard figure of the late Russian Silver Age. He grew up in the late imperial period. He was educated in Russia and in Germany. He was a right-wing Hegelian. Okay, so if you're not interested in philosophy, turn off for the next 2 minutes and have dessert. But it's important, actually, because what I'm trying to suggest is that you have to get inside this worldview in order to see how the world works. So he was a right-wing Hegelian. What does that mean? For him, it meant, so Hegelianism is about dialectics, and in the right-wing variants, it's generally about God. I'm not going to do extraordinary violence by summarizing his 20 books of philosophy in five sentences. Ilyin's view was that God was good, but weak. And therefore, the question of good and evil on earth had to be resolved by men, which is certainly how he would have put it. He would not have said men and women. The question of good and evil has to be resolved by men. So what this means is that there is an absolute good, right? But it's in some sense attainable by faith, but it has no practical meaning in the world. Every question of good and evil has to be decided, adjudicated, and resolved by human beings. What is absolute evil? Alongside many people who were suspicious of and opposed to the Bolshevik Revolution, Ilyin defined the Bolshevik Revolution itself as satanic, as absolute evil, as the eruption, right, of hell on earth. Not in a metaphorical way, as precisely evil. What follows from that is that the struggle against Bolshevism is absolutely justified. Almost all means in this struggle are also justified. Not a few people referred to Ilyin in the 1920s as a Chekist of God. It means that a struggle against fascism is in itself holy. He uses the word chivalrous or knightly. And note this phrasing. He writes, "He who opposes the chivalrous struggle against the devil is himself the devil," right? So he who is not with us is against us. We are all obligated to struggle against precisely Bolshevism. So Ilyin has to leave the Soviet Union, still Soviet Russia, in 1922. For him, Mussolini's coup d'etat and rise to power in 1923 is the moment of European redemption. He writes of Italy, and he writes of fascism in general, that a fascist coup d'etat is an act of salvation, which he means literally, right? Spasitelli. He means it literally. It's the same word that one uses for Christ as our Savior, right? It's the redemption of humankind, this sort of action. And in fascism itself, he has a rather beautiful phrase. He says that fascism is, and I quote, a redemptive excess of patriotic arbitrariness, right? Which is actually a very nice encapsulation of what it's all about. A redemptive, right, against Fascism, a redemptive excess of patriotic arbitrariness. So Mussolini's coup d'etat, not to pound this point in too much, was quote-unquote an act of salvation. At this time, Ilyin was living in Germany between 1922 and 1938. He lived in Germany, and in Germany he defended Hitler from what he took to be the unfair criticisms coming from the West, including the unfair criticisms coming from other Russian immigrants in Berlin. When Hitler rises to power in 1933, he defends Hitler, as I say, from the European press. He argues that what has happened, and you'll be familiar with this way of seeing things, so what has happened is, dialectically speaking, a pure reaction to Bolshevism. He writes in 1933, a reaction to Bolshevism had to come, and it came, right, quote unquote. And this is a very good thing, he says, because the rise of National Socialism, the rise of Hitler in Germany will prevent a European civil war. He describes Hitler's rise to power as a quote-unquote stay of execution for European civilization. He says so long as Hitler is in power in Germany and Mussolini is in power in Italy, European civilization has some chance of continuing. And in particular, he defends the persecution of Jews, accepting the typical fascist equation of Jews with Bolsheviks and Bolsheviks with Jews, and he defends also in particular the persecution of Jews on the basis of blood quota. This is all in the pre-war period. What he says in the post-war period is even more interesting, but I just want to make sure we have this straight. This is all in the 1920s, this in the 1930s. In the 1930s and 1920s, he also recommends fascism for Russia. He defines National Socialism as above all a spirit, right? Duch, above all a spirit in which Russians should share. He describes white fascism. He doesn't mean that racially, just to be absolutely clear about it. I mean, he does mean it racially, but he doesn't use the word white to mean, it doesn't sound like it would sound an American, right? If I say white fascism with your American ear, you're hearing white racism, but of course he means the white movement, right? The anti-revolutionary movement. But he describes white fascism as a future movement which will save Russia from civil war. He describes white fascism as what should come after the end of communism to bring order to Russia. For him, the great problem is, the great thing that has to be explained is why fascism hasn't come to Russia already, right? So from his point of view, given the way he thinks about Russia, on which a bit more later, the surprise and the shock and the difficulty is that fascism came first to Italy and Germany, and so he troubles himself to try to explain why fascism doesn't come first to Russia. And the answer is that, of course, Russia is too innocent. Russia is too good. Russia had been too cut off from Enlightenment ideas of liberalism and parliamentarism and socialism. And so when these quote-unquote microbes came from the West, Russia did not have a quote-unquote immune system which was capable of handling these things, and therefore it fell prey to Bolshevism. So Russia is too innocent. Now, what's even more, so that's a fairly typical, I mean, Ilyin is philosophically much more interesting than I can give credit to him here. But what I've just described to you is a fairly typical right-wing reading of the events of the 1920s and 1930s. There's a much higher population than perhaps we'd like to think of serious intellectuals who thought along those lines in the 1920s and the 1930s. What is perhaps a little bit more interesting is the way that Ilyin develops normative fascism for Russia after the Second World War. So Ilyin has an interesting adventure. He has to leave Germany in 1938. And what the Russian literature will tend to tell you about this is that this is because he resisted both Hitler and Stalin, which is interesting because it's a complete borrowing from the Ukrainian defense, right, of the OMB, right? They resisted Hitler and Stalin, which is not quite right with the OMB, and it's also not quite right with the Ilyin in different ways. What happens with Ilyin is that he is actually a consistent fascist. So he thinks that Europe would normally be a kind of fascist commonwealth, where different countries have different roads to fascism, and each fascism is different. And for that reason, he's unwilling to accept certain Nazi claims. He's unwilling to accept that National Socialism is a higher form of fascism than others. He naturally thinks that Russian will be the highest form of fascism, and he naturally thinks that every fascist should think that his own nation will have the highest form of fascism. He's skeptical about Hitlerian anti-Semitism. He agrees that the Jews are the Bolsheviks and the Bolsheviks are the Jews, but he thinks that Hitlerian anti-Semitism is so exuberant as to be counterproductive. And he even goes so far as to say, you should think about this for just a moment, that this kind of anti-Semitism actually helps the Jews, and that if it didn't exist, they would have to invent it. Right? On the logic that this kind of anti-Semitism actually builds sympathy for Jews. You can evaluate that how you like. The other reason why he was skeptical about National Socialism in the German form was that he believed that Hitler would be too sympathetic to Ukraine, which again I just leave to your contemplation. So, but the underlying point is that Ilyin believed, and as a fascist was quite properly, he was right to believe, that each fascism should be different, and that fascists shouldn't normally subordinate themselves to other fascists. So he doesn't subordinate himself to the demands of the various German ministries. He leaves Germany in 1938 and spends the war in Switzerland. If I don't forget to, interestingly, this is a little side note, but I just find it kind of wonderful. He is supported the entire time by an American millionaire, right? So if you imagine today a Russian political immigrant supported financially by an American millionaire, right? That person would be, by definition, right, an unacceptable political influence. Okay, I just couldn't resist mentioning that. So Ilyin lives in Switzerland. He does not experience the war, right? Switzerland is not a party to the war. And what's striking is that even after the war, when most people, at least declaratively, right, move away from fascism and National Socialism, it's after the war that Ilyin writes the political pamphlets between 48 and 54, which are his most read works, which are the ones which the President of Russia has clearly read, and which are the ones which recommend a kind of fascist geopolitics as well as a kind of fascist domestic policy. So in the post-war work, he takes a deep breath and he develops some of the premises of a Russian fascism at greater length and with more consistency than he had before. One premise is Russia's total historical innocence. And I have to say, these are the works of Ilyin which, as a historian, I find the most painful to read because they're absolutely, they're naive to the point of childishness, or like there's a point, I believe, where naivete becomes cynicism, or where cynicism becomes naivete again, right? But they're naive to the point of childishness, they're really painful to read, and they're unbelievably long. But it should be said that Ilyin, among his many virtues, which are not so typical of us, or maybe of the contemporary Russian elite, he was unbelievably hardworking. He published 40 books, roughly half in Russian, roughly half in German. He published a lot of stuff anonymously as well, lots of pamphlets and chapters. He was unbelievably industrious. So when he sets his pen to the idea of demonstrating that Russian history is all a matter of innocence, it's long, but it's not at all convincing. The basic idea is that Russia began with a kind of virgin birth. Only Slavs were involved, right? It's very important for him that no Europeans were involved. If the Norman controversy means anything to you, he and his wife took a very clear line on the Norman controversy. There were no Normans, there were no Scandinavians. It was a kind of Slavic virgin birth, Slavic politics. And he has to have that view, right? Because he's going to end up with the idea that everything here is good and this is a kingdom of good and everything else is a kingdom of evil. So he has to start from a virgin birth, right? And then he has this notion of an immaculate empire, and this is the part which would be the most comical, I think, if it were not so serious. And he goes to the entire history of Russia, so Muscovy. He goes to the entire history of Muscovy, and every single military engagement, and he does talk about most of them, is characterized as a foreign attack on Russia, right? So Muscovy starts out as this town, and it becomes the largest state in the history of the world, and every single battle was a battle of resisting the European blockade against Russia, which is how he says that Russia's history, I'm quoting, is a history of self-defense. And he says that from time immemorial, Europeans have practiced a quote-unquote continental blockade against Russia. So the first premise, again, of the fascist geopolitics is this idea of total historical innocence. The second premise is the idea of the Russian nation as an organic unity. Now, organic unity is one of these phrases which, like, very often, scholars impose on their sources. Organic is one of these words that we like to use. We like to impose it on sources. Even this is a word which screams out from the page at you. The idea of Russia as an organism. He repeats it over and over and over and over again. He means that Russia is literally like a body. What does that mean? If it's an organism, he writes, you can't divide it, right? You can only dissect it, he says, right? So any attempt to consider the territory of Russia, whatever that might happen to be, as being anything besides a total whole, right? Any mention of Ukrainians, which he always puts in quotation marks, or of national minorities, which he also puts in quotation marks, any mention of these things reveals that you are an enemy of Russia, who does not understand Russia's organic unity. There are no divisions, he repeats over and over again, in Russia. Now this is almost as fanciful, probably as fanciful as the way he writes about history, but it's important to understand it. Russian culture, he says, Orthodox culture is a culture of fraternity, which means that any apparent divisions within Russia will automatically be overcome by the workings of orthodoxy, and this is just the way things are. And of course, there is, quote unquote, a special arrangement of the soul, right? To quote Nikolai, a special arrangement of the soul in Russia, which means that Russia is different from Europe. And then comes a part which is quoted over and over and over again, directly or indirectly in contemporary Russia, which is that the Europeans do not understand this, right? The Europeans can't understand the special arrangement of the soul. Europe is there and we are here. And this is the third premise, the third axiom of the fascist geopolitics, that there is a clear line between this organic unity, which is Russia, right, between this kingdom of the heart and the kingdom of reason, which is Europe. And those are Eileen's terms: heart on the one side and reason on the other side. What's organic on one side and what's artificial on the other side. And what orthodoxy means in all of this, you might be thinking, what does Christianity mean? What Christianity means is that we are the Christians and they're not. This is the kingdom of love. Here people are loving. I mean, whatever the appearances might be, people are loving. And there people are not, right? And that's how religion plays into it. And this for him is literally, not metaphorically, an article of faith. Here we have a kingdom of good, which is confronting a kingdom of evil. And so that then brings Eileen to his definition of politics, which those of you who are familiar with the history of National Socialist law, and in particular the figure of Carl Schmitt, will find familiar. He defines politics as, quote, the art of identifying and neutralizing the enemy, right? So politics begins with this identification of who is good and who is evil. Okay, so how then does Eileen define what should happen inside of Russia? And in many ways, this, especially if you are following the development of Russian politics, and there are many of you here who are doing this much more closely than I am, you're likely to hear several bells ring when we go through this. He has a long programmatic text, an uncompleted book about the future Russian constitutional structure, as well as a few articles. And what he says is essentially this: there should be a leader, right? A capital L leader. There should be a leader. This leader is called, in most of the texts, a national dictator. In some of his constitutional texts, he uses the phrase head of state. And this leader is in his person is going to incorporate all of the major functions of politics. He's going to be the head executive, the head legislator, the head of the judiciary. What else is there? He's also going to be the head of the military. So every major function is going to be in this single person. The state is going to be centralized, so no federal units. He defines over and over again federalization as a way to destroy a state, which one should keep in mind when one thinks about Russian foreign policy towards Ukraine, right? Federalization is a mean to destroy a state. It's nothing else. Anyone who supports federation is an enemy of the Russian state. One of his corrections to pre-war fascism is that he says that a Russia should not be a one-party state. It should be a zero-party state. It should be a no-party state. The leader should not permit there to be any parties. There are two variants of this. One is no parties at all, and the other is, and this is again interesting for today's Russia, the other is allow parties, but make them be so ridiculous that they discredit the idea of parliamentarism itself, right? That's Elin's idea, which is clever. There should be elections, but the election should be ritualistic. The election should be, first of all, voting should be public. So it's like Hungary in the 1920s. The peasants should stand in the fields and raise their hands the way the landlords want them to. Voting should be public, And ballots should be signed. So just in case someone didn't notice you were voting for it, you should sign, every ballot should be signed. So there should be elections, but the elections have a purely ritual purpose of confirming the rule of the leader. There should not be civil society. Civil society is and of course with parties there's this whole traditional, as you would expect, fascist argument that you shouldn't have parties because a party represents only a part of the interests of the whole, and in representing a part it actually destroys the whole, and so on and so on. This is the same familiar analysis that was heard before. Civil society, similarly, civil society should not be allowed. There should not be organizations which are legal, which act beside, alongside, on the margins of, against the government. Every civil society organization should be in some way folded into a corporate structure. And by corporate structure, right, I don't mean IBM, I mean the interwar fascist idea of a corporate state, in which every social institution has its place in hierarchy, which is essentially divinely sanctioned. Ilyin goes out of his way to say that the middle classes should be at the bottom of this, right, below everyone else, on the logic that the middle classes are the most treacherous classes in Russian society. Again, it's hard to miss the resonance here, and that the middle classes, he says, inevitably bring dependence upon foreign enemies. So they should be, they can exist, but they should be at the very bottom. Okay, so when we've come this far, I think now we have a chance to evaluate what these kinds of arguments mean for the current of thought, which we call Eurasianism. Because although there are differences, it is the 1920s and 1930s which are at the source of contemporary Russian Eurasianism, and it is Ilyin, before all people, I think, who is the most inspirational. And to understand what Eurasianism is, I have to now take another step back and do another little moment of Russian history, which I promise won't last for more than about five sentences. There's some who want more, there's some who want less, I know. Eurasianism is the dialectical, remember Ilyin is a dialectical thinker, it's the dialectical resolution of the old Russian division between Westernizers and Slavophiles. So a Westernizer is someone who, and I can already, I haven't even said anything, but I can already feel the objections from the Russian historians in the room. Some of the nicer ones laugh. A Westernizer is someone who believes that Russian history is on the same track as that of Europe, but it's simply a couple of stages behind, and therefore a Westernizer recommends reform that will push Russia ahead to catch up to the West, to follow the same line of progress as the West. A Westernizer believes in progress, that there are stages and so on. So Westernizer will recommend reform, or maybe even revolution, as a way to skip stages, but ultimately a revolution is to catch up with the West, to catch up to the single history of the West, of which Russia is and should be a part. A Slavophile is a pluralist. A Slavophile is someone who says there are different cultures in the world. There might be a Western culture, there might even be a Western path or something, but there are multiple paths in the world. Ours is different. Russian culture is sufficiently different from Western culture that one can't speak of a single line of development. So Slavophiles are generally either extreme revolutionaries who think that Russia has a very special path to the future, or more generally they end up as conservatives. So what Eurasianism does, and what Ilyin does as a figure, as a person, as a thinker, is to overcome this division. What Eurasianism does is that it says that the division between the West and Russia, that division is actually artificial. And the reason it's artificial is that Enlightenment, liberalism, parliamentarism, that whole package, is not actually intrinsic to the West. That is actually artificial. That's been imposed on the West by elites, and explicitly or implicitly it usually means Jews. So that whole business of the Enlightenment and socialism and liberalism and universalism and cosmopolitanism, that whole package, that's not intrinsic to Western national history. They have had the unfortunate experience of having that imposed upon them. And so if you can clear that away, which again explicitly or implicitly means clearing the Jews away, if you can clear that away, then the natural historical course of the West is fascism, right? And that would be good. And once the West is fascist, then there is no division between West and East anymore, right? The West has its kind of fascism, and Russia has its kind of fascism. That's what Eurasianism is. It's the dialectical overcoming of the Slavophile Westernizer controversy. And Ilyin represents this in his argumentation, right? He also represents it in his person. It wouldn't be too hard, although you will not be invited to Russian talk shows if you say this, it would not be too hard to present him as a German philosopher who occasionally wrote in Russian. His mother was Russian. He wrote more in Russian. Sorry, his mother, what I say? His mother is German. His mother was German. He wrote more in German than he did in Russian. He spoke far more in German than he did in Russian. His dissertation was about a German philosopher, Hegel. His most important influence, although I can't go into why this is so important, was a German philosopher, Husserl, also the Dr. Vater of Heidegger, in a long, that's a long excursus I can't quite make here. He spent most of his working life active in German-speaking countries. When he went into psychotherapy, which he did with Freud daily, that was, of course, also in German, right? So he, in himself, is a kind of fusion, right, of Russia and a certain kind of West. Not the universalistic liberal West, which he despised, but a certain kind of West, the West of himself, the West of his milieu, the West of the people with whom he associated. So Ilyin, in his thought and in his life, represents this Eurasianism. Okay, now, what does that have to do with Eurasianism today? So when Ilyin is writing about these articles about fascism and the future of Russia, which I've summarized, the last set of articles from 48 to 54, which have been published as Our Tasks, which is kind of the primer. That's the thing to start with if you're remaking the Russian state today, or if you're studying the people who do. He dies in 1954. He's writing these from 48 onward. He dies in 1954, and this is very important because. In 1954, maybe not everybody, but he could still think of fascism as being normal in Europe. He could still think of that as being normal in Europe. He could still say that we have learned in the Second World War how to purify fascism, how to get rid of the elements we don't want, how to make it maybe more religious, how to avoid the one-party state, how to avoid totalitarianism, which is by which he meant the one-party state. He could still say that the typical European states are Spain and Portugal, right? So he looked at Franco and Salazar and said, this is what's normal. And by the way, when he defends Russian Empire, what move does he make? He says, well, of course, we don't have to consider Russian Empire as being illegitimate because all of the European countries are empires, right? So that's his little dodge. They're all empires. Now, what the problem, maybe it's a problem, maybe it's an opportunity, if you happen to be this kind of thinker, is that between 1954 and 2011, or 1954 and 1989, however you want to do it, certain things happened. Basically, to put it in a sentence, a Europe of empire became a Europe of integration. And all of the major European powers, starting with Germany, all of them moved the center of their political and economic engagement from a maritime empire to a continental site of integration. This is, I think, the central development in the history of Europe in the 20th century. It's extraordinarily interesting in and of itself. But here it's mainly important because of what it suggests about a past that has to be mastered. If you're going to be this kind of geopolitical fascist, you have to somehow overcome the European Union. Right? The European Union is now that thing, which is not in Ilyin's thought, and which has to be overcome if you're going to move the world back, if that's the right word, if you can move the world back towards the way that Ilyin saw it. And what this means, of course, is that if you're this kind of geopolitical fascist, your first priority is going to be the dispersion, the disintegration of the European Union, as in fact it is. That is the past to be mastered. Now, as a little footnote, this is obviously a total disaster for Europe, right? It's a complete and utter disaster for Europeans who decide they want to think along these lines, because what is being proposed to them is to go back to a past which doesn't even vaguely exist, right? What's being proposed to them is to go back to a past in which each European state will have its own history, its own independent right-wing trajectory. In the best of cases, that's the 1920s and 1930s. But it's worse than that if you're looking at it from a selfish European point of view, because you're not going to get your empires back, right? There is no moment in European history where these little nation states made it on their own. That simply never happened. And the idea that even Germany, right, even France could be cast back into a world where they're going to be disintegrated in small nation states is a terrifying prospect, right? That's an unmasterable past because there is no past there. They're being asked to step into an abyss, essentially. And some people, of course, are always pretty enthusiastic about abysses, and we can find plenty of Europeans who are very enthusiastic about that particular abyss right now, and they vote. Okay, with all of this in mind, the flow of policy from 2011 to 2015, I think makes a lot more sense. It makes a lot more sense that The moment in 2011 when democracy becomes an obvious farce is also the moment when the move against civil society begins, when the move against the middle classes as such in Russia begins. It makes a lot of sense that Russia's alternative to the European Union, which emerges in 2013, it's older than that, but emerges in its clear ideological form in 2013, Eurasia will be targeted against specifically European decadence, right? The idea that Europe has moved away from its normal core values is much more sinister when you think about what those core values are supposed to be, which in the best case is some kind of national populism, but probably is something more like fascism. So when you hear the word decadence, what that means is not fascist, right? So the next time somebody calls you decadent, right, you can say, yes, thank you. And then the policy towards Ukraine also makes a lot more sense within this framework. Of course, if you're a follower of Ilyin, you take for granted, as Putin said several times in the run-up to the Ukraine crisis, that Russia and Ukraine are one people, right? I mean, Ilyin knew nothing about Ukraine, right? Just as like, and it's interesting that none of the major policymakers in Russia who work on Ukraine, like maybe they're probably saying I'm probably wrong, but like Kisilov, all the people who are important, Surkov, Kisilov, Glazyov, Putin himself, they don't actually know a thing about the country, right? It's all axiomatic, right? It's all axiomatic, that this is artificial, that it's part of Russia, whatever it might be. And that comes straight from Ilyin. And so the idea that Ukrainians weren't a real society, weren't a real nation, right? That's the assumption behind the idea that you can just push their leadership around and nothing will happen. When Russia tries to push the leadership around in late 2013, something happens, which is a revolution, right? And it's that revolution which then prompts the war, the invasion of Crimea, and then the invasion of southeastern Ukraine. When that war comes, there are two interesting features of it. The first is that it is against the European Union. It's against Ukraine, but it's simultaneously against the European Union, not just in the sense that it violates the basic norms of European order, which it does, but also in the sense that it's accompanied by widespread and obvious Russian policies to support forces which are aiming to disintegrate the European Union. The second interesting feature is that the war is characterized as being entirely defensive, right? Which is, again, Ilyin. No matter what happens, it's a defensive war which is prompted by Europe's continental encirclement of Russia. And of course, at the moment of climax, when Russia annexes Crimea, Putin cites Ilyin in this, he says that Crimea is Russia's Jerusalem, which, make of it what you want. It's Russia's Jerusalem, and he cites Ilyin in this connection. Okay, which brings me finally to my conclusion, because I want to leave at least a few minutes for us to talk, which is how then we would return to these basic issues of states and interests and how fascism might help us to understand fascism as a framework, it's somebody else's framework which you think yourself into and think your way out of, right? When I say fascism is helpful, I don't want that to be taken out of context. The first has to do with states, right? So as I said at the beginning, a fascist geopolitics is totally comfortable with the notion of states being fluid, coming into existence, ceasing to exist. It's perfectly comfortable with the idea of disorder as not a means to an end, but as the end in and of itself. So it's not surprising within this framework that you can imagine that Russia would be a different kind of state, playing by different kinds of rules. It's not at all surprising within this framework that Ukraine could be not a real state, a subordinate state, an inferior state. And it's not surprising at all that the major thrust of Russian policy would be to try to get rid of the European Union, which simply does not fit. For Europe to be real, for it to fit into the kind of history that's natural and organic, the European Union has to go away, and there have to be, there have to be 25 or whatever it is, little mini fascisms running around, right? That would be normal. That would be the normal course of history. So, this speaks to the idea of realism, because there's a sense in which this is normative realism, right? This is like to the international relations theorists out there, in that Russians are taught, for example, in the diplomatic academy, they're taught that the only thing which is real are states. And they're taught that the European Union is, quote unquote, a semi-permanent structure, right? The idea is that everyone's going back to the nation state. But that's a kind of normative realism. It's not a description of the way the world actually is. It's a description of how we would like the world to be. We'd like to be one really flawed state amidst a whole lot of other really flawed states, that's the essence of this proposition. Russia has a basic problem. It has the problem, not that Russia's a fascist state, I wouldn't make that claim, but Russia has the basic problem that all states that follow the leader principle have. There is no succession. You do not know what to do with the succession. And the way that fascist states obscure this problem is they export it. They get involved in foreign adventures. They do glorious things during the lifetime of the glorious leader. They have no choice but to do that. And again, this is a point which was made in the last session. They have no choice but to do that. And the goal of doing that is to make everyone more like you in this particular case. You export your problem of succession to everyone else. If everyone else becomes a fake democracy with a leader principle, then everyone else has the same problem that you have. And that brings me to interests. That is in the interest, not of the Russians themselves, but certainly in the interest of the current Russian leadership. They cannot solve their succession problem. They cannot talk about their succession problem. All they can do is spread it out in this way. All they can do, to use the Freudian term, is to project this problem elsewhere. And if you think using Freudian terms like projection or displacement is not justified, consider the way that Ilyin himself and Russian elites today escape into highly sexualized language the moment when something challenges the basic worldview, right? So the moment when Ukrainian protests begin, for example, 2013, you have Kisilov on Russian television talking to tens of millions of people using unbelievably sexualized language. Because if something doesn't fit the way things are supposed to go, there must be some perversion behind it, right? The entire European Union, right, 60 years of the history of extraordinarily rational and successful integration is presented as a sexual perversion, right, a sexual perversion. And 100 years before that, when Ilyin is discussing, is having polemics with the God seekers in the 1910s in Russia, and when he thinks he's identified their weaknesses, he goes up and points his finger at them and says, sexual perversion, sexual perversion, sexual perversion, right? When things fall out of the order they're supposed to be in, then you talk about sex and about somebody else's perversion. If that doesn't if you don't think that invites Freud into discussion, then just take Ilyin's own example. He missed the First World War because he went to Vienna in order to have daily psychoanalysis with Freud himself. Okay. And then, I don't see what's funny about that. How many? A lot of us would take that opportunity. And think about, he did this while he was writing his doctoral dissertation, right? I mean, Yale offers an unbelievable set of psychic services, right? But we don't actually have Freud giving daily psychotherapy to our philosophy students, right? Okay. And so then the third and final thing I want to leave you is with a certain difference between, because I want to be fair to the thinker I'm talking about. And of course I'm not being fair to him in a number of ways. One of them is the rhetorical style which I use, which would be totally alien to him. But I want to be fair to him in a certain way, which is that he was a man who believed in truth, right? And one difference between his version of Eurasianism and the version that we have today is that he believed, I mean, one can make of his claims and his axioms and his theology what one wants, but he believed that he was seeking truth, right? He believed he was following strict methods and was seeking truth. That is not true, right? That is not true of Alexander Dugin. That is not true of the Eurasianists of today, who are happy to accept the premise that it's all, a game of circle, right? It's all a game of illusions, it's all a game of mirrors, and so on. And one of the ways in which he was honest had to do with his form of fascism. So you can think about fascism, the relationship between fascism and communism in two ways. One is, probably more ways, but let me just suggest two. One is you can say fascism and communism are intertwined, right? You can say, look, Ilyin was a right-wing Hegelian, the Bolsheviks were left-wing Hegelians. You can say Ilyin was a kind of theological Leninist, which he was. I mean, he had a whole theory about how Russian intellectuals can experience God the way the peasants can, and so they'll tell the peasants the right moment to act in God's name, which is just, it's Leninism of the right, basically. You can say these things are intertwined. That's one thing to do. The other is you can say, and this is Ilyin's view, and I want to be fair to him, that fascism is a reaction to communism. It's a necessary purge. I'm not endorsing this view, I'm just trying to be fair about what it is. And therefore, one of the things that Ilyin thought was that when communism comes to an end, there has to be national regeneration in Russia, which begins with a critical assessment of the communist past, right? And that is one way in which he certainly differs from the Eurasianists of today, because that is the opposite of what they advocate. They advocate this mishmash of fascism and Bolshevism. And in particular, and I'll just leave you with this, in particular, Ilyin thought that the top levels of the Russian government should undergo decommunization, right? And that no one, for example, who had been a KGB officer should be allowed to serve in the top levels of Russian government. And so at this level, right, if Putin truly wanted to be a faithful student of Ilyin, he would not be reburying him or putting flowers on his grave or citing him out of context. He would be resigning from office.
So we do have time for just a few questions, not too many. I can see 4 hands up, so I'm gonna maybe, all right, it keeps on growing, okay. I think we have time, frankly, really for about 3 questions, I would say. So I'm gonna go with Andy Moravchik first, and anybody, John Herbst and Mr. You said Cutler, is that right? Okay.
So
maybe you should stand up because there's quite a crew here, and if you'd like a microphone, you're welcome to take that as well.
so that was brilliant, and I can't judge some of it because I'm not an expert on Russian intellectual history, but until the end, I'm completely persuaded. The last step seems to predict that Putin should take a kind of aggressively, morally affronted position toward the EU, like it's a perversion of history, that he really should feel that it is immoral. But I'm wondering if there really is the evidence for that, as opposed to the view that he is rhetorically opposed to them to the extent they're getting in the way of him doing something that he wants to do, and it's a kind of defensive rhetoric. And I'm thinking that were that true, we should view, were your argument true, we should view 2 things. First of all, we shouldn't view that rhetoric, anti-EU rhetoric, start at the kind of last minute, 2013, when he needs it politically, but it should have been a continuous current all along. And secondly, it should be more offensive. I mean, as we established in the last session, it's almost easier to read him as being appalled morally by the hypocrisy of the United States than by the immoral cosmopolitan of Europeanism of Europe. So why don't we see more of what you predict we should see vis-a-vis the EU if your story is right in that last step?
Okay, I guess given time constraints, I should collect the next 2 and then answer them all together. I will answer it.
He will answer it, yes.
He's lost.
I will.
We'll answer it.
That was terrific. Quick question. How do you evaluate the Russian historian Lev Gumilyov as the originalist?
Yes. Did Ilyin posit any positive social basis for a fascist and Russian fascist regime? I think the answer is no. But because you said he negated civil society, which indeed makes him a very right-wing Hegelian, however, you did mention that he had this corporatist vision of it, at the bottom of which was the middle class, and implying that he had, if not a full-blown sociological theory, at least some categories by way of which to make sense of society. So did he see a positive social basis, like Barrington Moore did, for example, or the current historiography of the interwar period that views fascism as a mobilizing, binding movement? Did he have social categories that would be useful for answering the question? Did he have a positive social basis for fascism?
So I'm going to punt on historiography. We're going to talk about this later. Andy's question. So I think that you do see the predictive value of it, and it's a little bit our optics and where we're looking, and when we start to look. So as far as the European Union being a moral affront, I agree with you that this changes, but it changes earlier than 2013. If you follow the way Putin talks about the European Union, it is basically positive through 2004. In fact, you can pick out some extraordinarily positive statements up to about 2004. From 2005 forwards, that goes downward, which I think is by no coincidence at all the moment when he starts, when Ilyin is at the center of the Kremlin Reading Group. Which I'm not kidding about the Kremlin Reading Group, right? I mean, whatever we say about them, they read books. I mean, this whole presentation assumes that they read books, which they do. They do read, but they don't read the books that I want them to read, but they read books. And as far as the moral affront, the deeper you get into the Russian discourse, the clearer this is. So when in 2011, there is this funny interchange always between America and the EU. I mean, they do anything involving power. they blame it on America. So Hillary Clinton was personally responsible. She gave the signal, as Putin says, for the revolt and the protests in 2011. But most of the discourse and most of the policy reaction is actually about the European Union. And the idea is that these people have quote-unquote European values that they've been circulating in Europe. And then the policy response is, and we have a Russian police official saying this, which I'm sure is not true, but he says, we believe that now almost all those people have immigrated to Europe, right? We've purified ourselves of these people. And then about the nature of the affront, this is not so much Putin style, although there is a little bit of Putin, but it's more the people around him. So I mean, I can send you some names of some folks who have extraordinarily well-developed views about the European Union and its decadence. But I mean, the kind of work you do, I think it's interesting that in February 2014, even the foreign minister Lavrov, in a long article, the English version of this left this out, but in the Russian version of it, he says, and of course one of the preconditions for our engagement with the European Union will be an improvement on the question of decadence. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the basic idea. So it reaches all the way into the most official of official statements. But at the other extreme, like the modern Eurasianists like Dugin, you get things like, let's be clear about the West. The West is where Lucifer fell. The West is the source of all evil and all hypocrisy, and so on and so on and so on. But anyway, I mean, on your basic question of timing, we actually do get it before 2013, which is why when 2013 happened, I was already reading this stuff, and then I felt like I was more up on what was being said. So when in December of 2013, when Sergei Kisilov, who's the main Russian television talk show host, he models himself on Anderson Cooper, which is funny for a number of reasons. He talked about the EU as being pedophilia, right? He talked about the Swedes as having an official pedophilic policy. They made the claim that they tried to tell the Ukrainians if you join the European Union, then gay marriage is mandatory. So they immediately slipped this line into the sexual perversion business. So it is actually out there. I'm punting on historiography because that's going to take too long. On the social basis, I'm a little puzzled by this because in order that he doesn't really have a theory of social change. And so he doesn't have a notion of how one part of Russian society becomes another part of Russian society. And when he does discuss, and there are probably people who know these writings better than me, but what I notice is when he talks about the Russian leader, he has no idea where that Russian leader is going to come from, right? There's just no notion that person is going to be, he says it's going to be someone who's beyond history. How do you get a person who's beyond history, right? What's the mechanism for selecting a person who's beyond history? And then with social structure, he does have, I think, in some ways, a very sensible description of the Russian peasantry. And there are a couple of articles where he tells, his right-wing friends that you can't go back on NEP. If we come back to power, we're not going to take the land back away from the peasants. We're not going to do that for all kinds of reasons, among them sort of good, ethical, conservative reasons. So he does believe in peasants with property. We know that, and he believes in people with lots of power at the top. And he believes the middle classes are inherently suspicious, which lines up rather well with current Russian policy, which is deliberately pro-oligarchy, right, and deliberately anti-middle class, and is impoverishing pretty much everybody. But he doesn't have a theory of social change, and so therefore I don't know how he could have had an idea of the social basis of fascism. In his rhetorical work, a lot of energy goes into the description of how amazing the leader is going to be, right? It's going to be terrific, it's going to be amazing. A lot of effort goes into the description of this leader figure. But how you get him, and fundamentally, I'm going to close on this note, what happens when he dies? How you get the next one? Because you could say, well, you get him when communism collapses, and then a hero emerges from that struggle, right? And you could arguably say, okay, that hero is Putin. You could follow that logic that far. But that deep void that opens on the question of succession, that seems to me to be the basic problem. Because without a theory of social support or of institutions and how they interact, or of social change, and when you crush the middle classes, civil society, and you make parties a joke, you're inviting this void, this political void. And I think that political void, that black hole, is the force of gravity which sucks so much else in.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for really erudite and provocative. We have had this email exchange. I think this is, as you mentioned, new work that you're beginning to work on right now, and I'm really pleased you chose here as a venue to start talking about it. I also note that it's kind of ironic. The next panel is on Russo-German relations and the future of Europe. I'd like to invite our panelists to come up. We can take, if people need to take a quick break, bathroom break.